I'm so honored to be here with all of you. The hardest thing for me about today is that I have to leave right after this session is over, and what I really want to do is spend days hiking and talking and dreaming with all of you. So thank you to Michael and to Dar and Noland and others who invited me to be here. I'm here with my husband, David, and at least we have this. At least we have this. So I hope we'll consider this the beginning of a conversation and not the end. So I want to start by, first of all, expressing our gratitude to Imam Abdullah Antepli, who was supposed to be my conversation partner, but because of all of the upside-down travel, wasn't able to actually get here, and I know he regrets that deeply. And so I'm going to talk a little bit, and then Dar and I will engage in some conversation, and we'll have time for Q&A. I want to put forward an idea for you, and that idea is that in this time of multiple compounding crises, that there is a way forward, that there is a path to a better future for all of us, and that each one of us has the ability to be moral leaders in this time and to continue to take steps to build a more just and loving society. I do believe that sometimes the greatest nightmares and the most difficult times become birth moments for the next chapter. And it's my deepest hope and prayer that the rupture of this time will also awaken within each of us and all of us a very fierce passion for what it would mean to move forward toward a more just and loving society now. So I'm a pulpit rabbi. I live in Los Angeles. And about 11 or 12 years ago now, I gave a sermon at Ikar, our community in Los Angeles, that ended up really turning our community on its head. As clergy, you talk a lot, and you never know if anyone's listening. But sometimes there's a sermon that sticks, and it ends up changing you and changing the community. And so I want to tell you a little bit about that sermon, which is connected to the book that I wrote called The Amen Effect, Ancient Wisdom to Mend Our Broken Hearts and World, which came more than a decade later as a kind of expanded version of that seed that was planted some years ago. So at the time, I was receiving pastorally so many people in our community who were speaking to me about and sharing with me that they were desperately lonely. The kind of acute loneliness that really harms our spirits, that leaves us kind of encased in darkness and not believing that there's really any path forward. We know that everybody experiences loneliness at some point, and some of us experience acute and ongoing loneliness. And I saw, as a pastor, as a rabbi, the damage that it was doing to individual spirits. And around that time, I also got exposed to some of the new literature around loneliness. There was a guy named Dr. John Cacioppo from University of Chicago, I believe, who started researching and found that acute loneliness is essentially the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That loneliness not only harms our spirits, but it actually hurts our bodies. It hurts our hearts and our lungs in physical ways too. And what I recognized at that point was that this was not only an intersection of spirit damage and body damage, but also that loneliness was threatening our democracy. And that sense has only deepened over the course of the subsequent 10 or 12 years. Because I read Hannah Arendt, who says, the great 20th century political philosopher, who says that loneliness and social alienation and isolation are preconditions to tyranny. That totalitarian regimes cannot take hold in environments in which people know and trust their neighbors. And over the course of the last several years, we've seen so many alarming studies that have told us that we don't know our neighbors. We have completely closed ourselves off into small, isolated clusters, ideological bubbles with other people who we see as part of our tribe because they look like us, or they talk like us, or pray like us, or vote like us. And it's actually doing grave harm to our social systems. And I saw just before COVID in 2019 a couple of studies that I just want to share with you. One that said that 1 in 3 Americans do not know the names of their next door neighbors. the people who live to their right and to their left, which is actually terrifying. And another that said that 20%, 1/5 of Americans say that they don't have one single confidant in the world. Not one person with whom they can share their pain, their fear, their dreams. Nobody to check in on them when they're sick and bring them some food. And so it seems to me that we are going through a crisis of actually 3 intersecting trends at this point. A crisis of spirit, of body, and also of our society. And I think that democracy itself is actually on the line right now. Hannah Arendt, again, she says that when people are isolated from each other, that's when they're more likely to attach themselves to conspiracy theories. Because I always think about this, if it rains on your wedding day, and someone tells you that the Jews control the weather through their space lasers, you could be pretty resentful of the Jews unless you actually know a Jew. And then you find out that it rained on my wedding day too, and then you're like, this isn't checking out. And so what we need to do is know Jews, right? But we also need to know Muslims, and we need to know Christians and Catholics and atheists and Hindus and Buddhists and Sikhs. We need to know each other. But we don't really know each other. I remember shortly after the 2016 election, one of the most powerful experiences that I had was we had a gathering at the Islamic Center of Southern California in Los Angeles. And the room was packed with clergy. It was mostly Latino clergy. And someone from the Islamic Center stood up and said, I'm speaking now to the Latinos in the room. I need you to know that if they come after you, they're going to have to get through me first. And he said, I am reaching out to embrace you with arms of love and support. And then the next representative from the Islamic Center got up and said, I suspect that for most of you, this is your first time in a mosque. I suspect that most of you have never had tea with a Muslim before, so I just want to invite you to call me and take me out for tea, because I love tea, and I really love people, and I want to know you, and I want you to know me. And that felt to me like a seed of an idea that could help us survive those dark years and could help us remember that we belong to each other. So for me, when I met these intersecting crises of spirit and body and democracy, I did what rabbis do, which is I went deep into my past to look in the ancient wisdom of my people and see what might help us navigate this time. And I found a text that had been sort of tracking me for the last now 2 decades plus. I found it for the first time when I was in rabbinical seminary, and I didn't really understand it, and I photocopied it and put it away and found it again some years later. And I recognized in this text, as I encountered it again now, having experienced more of life, having named babies and buried people, having stood with people under the wedding canopy and also helped people through divorce, having experienced my own love and loss, I realized that the power of this ancient ritual articulated in this obscure ancient text was actually the message that I needed in order to survive and to help my community survive and thrive in times of great rupture. This is what the ritual is. I'm going to take you through it because I find it to be so powerful and so moving. It's my deepest hope that somehow the image of this ritual will also be embedded in your own heart and will help give you strength. So the ancient rabbis talk about a pilgrimage ritual when the Jewish people 2,000 years ago, when the temple stood in Jerusalem, would ascend to Jerusalem, a city on a hill. Hundreds of thousands of people from all corners of the land and some from the diaspora. They would go up to Jerusalem and climb the steps of the ancient temple, the most sacred place on the holiest of days, and they would enter through this giant arched entryway, like some of you might have experienced in the old city of Jerusalem now, where there's some remnants of these arches. And they would turn to the right, and then they would circle around the perimeter of that holy space where today the Dome of the Rock stands. Have any of you visited the Dome of the Rock and you've seen this space? So you can kind of envision the ritual. Hundreds of thousands of people moving in this direction around the courtyard and then leaving through the same gate that they came in, except for someone with a broken heart. And that person would go up to Jerusalem, would go up the steps, would enter through the archway, but they would turn to the left when everyone else turned to the right. and they would walk around that courtyard in the opposite direction. And here's where this sacred encounter would occur. The people who are going this way, someone would see the person coming this way and would stop and look into their eyes and ask this simple question. In the ancient Hebrew, it's malach. What happened to you? Tell me about your heart. Tell me why you're broken today. And the person who's going this way would gather up all of their courage and they would say, I am grieving because my father has just died and my heart is broken. Or they would say, I just feel so alone in this world and I feel like nobody in the world understands me. Or they would say, I'm just so worried about my kid. I just need someone to tell me she's going to be okay. And then the people who are going in this direction, that person who sees the bereaved, the bereft, the ill, would give that person a blessing and would say, may the one who dwells in this place hold you with love as you navigate this difficult period. And that's it. That's the end of the ritual. Then they'd keep going on their way. And what I realized about 10 or 12 years ago when I encountered this text in the midst of these, compounding crises of our time and all the brokenheartedness and the danger to our spirits and our bodies and our democracy was that we want to retreat from each other, but we need to turn toward each other. Because each of the characters in this ancient drama, they don't want to actually connect with each other. The person who's walking to the left, think of when you were bereft and bereaved and ill. Maybe some of you are holding that grief now. The last thing we want to do is show up in a big public forum where the whole world is walking in one direction and we're walking in the other, because it requires so much vulnerability to be able to stand up and say, I'm just not okay today, and trust that you're going to be held with love. And yet that's what they're called to do. And the folks who are going in this direction are actually having the spiritual peak moment of their entire lives. I've read, and some of you may have even experienced, about the Hajj, about what happens when millions and millions of the faithful go to Mecca and they're all moving together in chorus. And it's such a profound sense of oneness. To peel away from that oneness and go check on a stranger who's crying is completely counterintuitive. And yet we realize that that is exactly why we're there. Just to see another human being who's struggling and to offer love and to offer care. And I realize that maybe the message of our time is that it's precisely when we are most inclined to pull away from each other that we actually have to turn toward each other. And when we do, we turn toward one another with compassion, with grace, and with curiosity. We don't tell people, we ask people, Malach, tell me about your heart. This message transformed my community. It helped us understand that even when we feel so powerless because of the weight of the world, because of climate change, and because of war, and because of poverty, and racism, and human cruelty, that we actually do have agency. We're not powerless, and we can turn toward one another again and again and again in deceptively simple ways by actually just moving our seat over and sitting with the person who's crying and saying, hey, you seem like your heart is a little bit broken today. Do you want to talk about it? Do you want to tell me what you're holding? At the end of my book, which really dives into all the various aspects of what this ritual might mean and how it can help us transform, I share that in this ancient text, it actually includes two different people, not one, as examples of who turns to the left. The first is the brokenhearted, the bereft, the bereaved, the ill, the lonely. And the second is the ostracized. And I want to spend just a couple of moments talking about this for us today before Dar and I enter into conversation now, because I feel that this matters now more than perhaps ever before. The ostracized is this ancient category of punishment for someone who's caused grave damage, either to individuals or to the community as a whole. And they're one step short of excommunication. The ostracized are people who have actually endangered the community. They don't come for dinner, they don't come to the conference, they don't sit in the coffee shop, but they do show up on the most sacred days in the most sacred of places. And when they enter that sacred place, they turn to the left like the brokenhearted. And when the community comes toward them, they don't sidestep them or avoid them. They look into their eyes and they ask, tell me about your heart. And that person also responds saying, I've been ostracized from the community. And they too receive a blessing. And I feel that as much as the call of our time is to turn toward one another with compassion, especially and even when we're brokenhearted, I think it matters even more and is even harder to do so when the person is not coming toward us but might even be coming at us. When it's somebody who's actually hurt us, when they've posted things on Instagram that break our hearts, right? When they've chosen a side of history that feels to us like it threatens us and it hurts our community, to be able to look at them and still see their humanity. And instead of judging them, to ask them, tell me about your pain. What can I learn from your vantage point? Because I see the world in this direction, but you see the world in that direction. And I think when we do that, we're able to meet sorrow with sorrow. We're able to meet heartache with heartache, and we're able to rehumanize the other, and in so doing, also rehumanize ourselves. I think this is the spiritual call of our time. And I think this is the way that we can start to break through some of the impossibility of the moment, to grab onto what Dar was saying earlier, that kind of sacred impossible, which is healing through the long darkness and actually beginning to build something new now, something that is rooted in love and that is rooted in justice and that actually makes space for every single one of us. So I thank you so much for having me here, and I look forward to being in conversation with you. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. That was amazing. Just another round of applause for Rabbi Brous. I also want to follow up with saying that Imam Abdullah Antepli, that was supposed to be with us today, we held the seat to the very last minute. So we didn't take him off the schedule, hoping that Delta would get its act together, but not all prayers are answered. We're going to have a moment to take a few questions from the audience for Rabbi Brous, but I'll start with one. You talk about doubling down on two truths at once. I would love for you to share about how to hold that complexity and what you've learned with that.
So I think I want to start by just sharing with all of you that I just got back from Jerusalem. I spent 3 weeks there to meet with peace builders, Israeli and Palestinian, to see family and to learn and to try to reawaken my own imagination of what's possible in that place. The trauma is so profound, and the sense of grief and loss and uncertainty is so raw and palpable in the streets. And my trip began as soon as I landed. I went to an arena in Tel Aviv that was packed with Israeli Jews and Palestinians who had come together to proclaim that there was another way, that it's time to end this terrible war and bloodshed, that it's time for the hostages to be returned home to their family, and that it's time for us to dream again about what peace could actually look like. Peace, which has become a bad word here, right? You seem like a Pollyannish, naive fool if you talk about peace here. But to talk about a just peace and to dream of a just peace. And every single person who spoke on that stage, and there was total parity between Palestinians and Israelis on the stage, every single person shared that message. Most of them had lost immediate family members. There was one hostage who had been released from Gaza. There were people whose families were murdered on October 7th. There were people whose families have been killed since October 7th. I just spent a couple of hours weeping and looking at these people who have experienced so much pain and anguish, just crying out for there to be another way. And I know, and we all know now, that when we are experiencing trauma and anguish and grief and fear, it is extremely difficult to access empathy. And yet somehow these folks who were the most proximate to the pain were able to access their empathy and were able to lead from empathy. That's how my trip began. My trip ended with 2 days. One in the West Bank, where I visited 3 Palestinian villages, where the threat of settler violence has completely undone any semblance of safety that any of them felt like they had for themselves and for their families. We talked to Palestinian activists on the ground who showed us where their homes and their school had been taken down to rubble by vigilante extremists who have no right engaging in the behavior they're engaging in, but they seem to be doing so with impunity. And the very next day, I went to the site of the Nova Festival on the Gaza border and walked through these makeshift memorials and saw where all of these young people had been cut down by violence. And even as we wept and we grieved for these people who died there, we could hear the bombs landing in Gaza. And I realized that I was holding inside my body a true sense of pain and grief for the Israelis who suffered and for the Palestinians who suffered so greatly in this moment. And that means that it's not impossible. And so I think if we are to imagine a different kind of future ahead of us, we actually have to see the humanity in each other, and we have to hold the grief and the pain for one another and with one another. And I know that that can be done because I'm doing it, and I know that many of you are also doing it. This kind of zero-sum binary reality where there's a winner and there's a loser, there's a victim and there's a villain, that only leads to endless war. And what I heard from speaking with peace builders there is that we have to do everything in our power to end the fantasy of endless war as the only way through this, and instead to affirm that it's time, that there is actually a different path, and that path is a pathway toward a just peace in which all of the people of that region can actually live in dignity.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to open it up for a few questions. So we have people running mics. If you want to raise your hand, starting with, great.
Yeah, Richard Morton from the University of Artificial Intelligence. I wonder, when you have these conversations, they tend to be dominated by the extremes on either side. How is it possible? What do we do to bring that conversation to the center, to bring those conversations to, I think, the silent majority?
Well, thank you, Richard. I think that's actually what's happening here. I do believe that extremism is the great danger to our time. And I think what we have to do is, instead of ceding the public square to the extremists, who will be by nature the loudest and the most dominant voices, instead to reclaim the public space and to reclaim it with empathy for the other instead of turning against the other. I know that that's possible. I think it's very hard to do that in the dynamic of kind of public theatrics that takes place in the public square, and it's much more likely that that kind of discourse will happen in smaller and more intimate spaces. And also in sacred spaces where people agree that our intention is actually to turn toward one another with curiosity and to do no harm to each other as we learn about one another. And this is why I love this ancient ritual so much, because ultimately our sacred spaces have to be big enough to hold people who literally see the world from another vantage point that we do. I've been in lots of conversations about, how big should this tent be and who should be left outside of our tent. And I think that the ancients are whispering to us, stretch open your hearts. They're just human beings like you are. And maybe if you get a little bit curious, you might learn something that you didn't know. So I think the answer is not counter-protests. I don't think it's about trying to outsmart people on the street. I think it's about creating a third space, like this space, where people are actually willing to sit around the table from each other, look into each other's eyes, ask questions, be uncomfortable, and actually be stretched wide open by one another.
Well, thank you so much for both of you. It's heart-thrilling what I heard, and my question is related to like bigger perspective. I tend to see the bigger perspective, and I worked in resilience in different aspects in academia and as a professional. And you can have this reverse person with broken heart as a cancer patient, as someone losing parents, as someone youth and unemployed, and all the time when you try to help them, you say like, you didn't live my experience to be able to help me. So it's always us, they. This needs to end. And I don't like to sound naive, but even not discussing this for humans, for people who hate animals and think that they are transmit disease, and others who love animal, if you dig deeper into them, like why you hate them that much, like cats or dogs, and it's for decades of cultural inheritance that what have been told, that what we have been told. And then I said, like, cat will never provoke you. And I had this experience, even myself. I entered into the cat wars, or the dogs were, like 4 years ago in the during COVID time. And they started with harassing me, and then we fall in love, for example. So it's really what it takes to be in the other side. It's the $1 million question. We really need to touch on that. And thank you.
Thank you, Rania. I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but I appreciate. I mean, we were talking yesterday with some folks about AI and what the dangers of AI are, and the kind of inherent dehumanization that many people are worried about as this technology advances. And I was thinking about, the nature of empathy and what it means to try to envision ourselves in someone else's position, and can we do that, and how far do we extend our ability to actually see the other, and is that something that machines and technology will be able to do for us? I don't know. I think, and you're asking essentially, can we also do that for all living beings? How far can we extend our hearts?
Was just trying to give like a very simple example, but for the bigger picture, what can be done, like action form, to be in a position to reach out to that one person, reversing and not willing to listen because of, I can't, like, as you said, we need to empathize with them to put ourselves in their shoes, but it's so much inherited. It can be hatery or pain or you name it. So how it cannot be reversed overnight. What can be done in that space?
My answer to my very simple answer to this question, Rania, and we should certainly talk more, is we have to learn how to stay at the table. We have to learn to stay at the table, and you can't change everybody's heart, but we also can't give up on trying to open and stretch each other's hearts and our own. I share a number of stories in the book about times where I stayed at the table and sometimes failed, and stayed at the table and sometimes feel like something broke open a little bit. And it is actually possible to make a little bit of a change or a little bit of a difference. In one of those stories, I sat with someone who really, by many measures, is my ideological opponent, and we sat together for almost 3 hours, and it was incredibly painful. We see the entire world in totally different ways, and I wanted desperately to get up and leave the table, but I forced myself to stay and to keep asking and to keep engaging and to try to allow him to see my humanity and to try to see his. And I remember when I got up from that table, and I was trembling for days afterwards, and I became James Comey. I wrote down every single thing that had happened in the conversation so I could remember all of it. And I remember thinking, was that a waste of time? Was it worth it at all? Did anything happen? And I realized on some level, he had become not a caricature in my mind, but a man who held views that I found toxic. And that in its own right was helpful and important for me. And then I hoped that the same had happened for him. And then a few years passed, and I saw that it had. That doesn't always happen. It doesn't always work. But I believe if there ever is going to be change, it's only going to be because of relationships, because we start to see each other in the fullness of our humanity. And that forces us to start to think differently and to break down some of those stereotypes and conspiracy theories and racism that actually blocks us from seeing the humanity in each other.
I think we have time for about 3 more questions. I'll say this is a very dangerous job for me because I desperately need LASIK. So, but I see something. Yeah, okay, great.
Hi, I'm Jen Goldman-Wetzler. First of all, I want to say thank you to you both. Also, Sharon, I listen to your podcast, your sermons every week, and disperse them to all of my friends, many of whom know you personally, and they're always very thankful that I do. So thank you for all of your work. I have a manifesto that I wrote for myself about a year ago, and for each of my values, I list a hero who represents that value. And I think I've listed your name on 2 of those. And at the top of that list is courage. And Dar, you so appropriately introduced Sharon with moral courage, the kind of value of moral courage that you embody. And so my question for you is, so for me, I'm a conflict specialist. I have a PhD in organizational psychology with a focus specifically on intractable conflict. I've worked in Israel, Palestine for many years. And yet, even for someone like me, it is incredibly difficult to consistently find my voice, especially with regard to gender. I often feel doubly powerless. Thinking about people who are behind the scenes right now as we're speaking, trying to hammer out a deal between Hamas and Israel. And so my question really is, for me or for anybody, what advice would you give about remembering to hold your voice and claim your power and be involved in ways that make sense to you, even when that may seem so difficult?
Thank you, Jen. Thank you for sharing that. The first thing that comes to mind is something that I think people attributed to Michael Moore many years in the 2016 election right afterward, but I don't think he was the originator of this, so tell me if you know who actually said this. But he said, remember in 8th grade choir when we needed to hold one note for a really long time? Longer than any human could possibly hold a note. Do you remember what we did? One person would start the note, and then before it ended, the next person would jump in and start the note, and then the next. And by that time, the first person had caught their breath, and they were able to pick up and continue the note. So what I learned from this is none of us can do this work alone. It is exhausting. It's backbreaking. It is impossible to avoid the pitfalls of despair if we think that we're in this alone. We're not. And we have to learn how to trust each other, that others can pick up the baton and carry on. As Dr. King said, we have to trust that others are our partners in the work, and we can take a breath and then return to the work when we are able to reclaim our hope and our sense of possibility. That's something that I take really seriously. And I think that's part of the reason also that it's so powerful to find yourself in fellowship, because these are the people who are helping pick up the baton when each one of us needs to take our breath. At the end of every single week, no matter how much the pressure is on me that week, no matter how tight my deadline, no matter how important it is that I finish my work, when the sun goes down on Friday, I'm offline for 25 hours, and nothing breaks that. 25 hours where I'm just breathing and singing and taking a nap and trusting that someone else is picking up the baton, and on Saturday night, I'm gonna carry on. So I really feel like part of this is about remembering that it's not on our shoulders alone, and finding ourselves in partnership and fellowship and relationship with others who are on the same side of history and who can engage in this walk with us. The other thing I want to share is that I mentioned that these peacemakers, peace builders who I encountered in Israel and Palestine, these are some of the most courageous people alive. And I often feel in the diaspora that I'm just getting bombarded every day. I mean, I get like uppercut from the right and lower jab from the left or whatever, and I feel like, oh, it's so despairing, and every alert that comes on my phone is making me lose hope more and more. And then I think of the folks of the Bereaved Families Forum, Parents Circle, the Combatants for Peace, the folks from Standing Together. I mean, these are people who are on the ground, warriors for a just peace and for a just future. And I feel like, who am I, to lose my hope? I need to replenish. I need to go for a walk or a bike ride in the mountains and come back and get back to work. And so I hope that in some ways, looking at some of the folks who are on the ground and knowing that our job is to amplify and platform and resource the people who are most proximate to conflict, who are most impacted by conflict, is actually, that's actually, I think, our call now as people, who have the privilege of being in the diaspora as so much heartache is unfolding there.
Heather? And after Heather, we'll take one more final question.
Yeah, hello? Yeah. Thank you to both of you. My name's Heather Son. I'm from the Africa Leadership Initiative, South Africa. I found myself sitting here saying, so we'll do that, and then what, and then what, and then what? So I'm trying to play it out in my head. And I'm doing that against the backdrop of a South African experience, where after struggling against racial oppression, we won freedom, but the quip of the day was, we'll give them the vote, but we'll keep the banks. So, and today when you look at South Africa, the oppression is one of economics. I like the idea of having a vision and having a spiritual underpinning as a way to sustain a prolonged effort. I like that idea. But what I'd like to maybe explore, ask for your insight on, is how do you see this playing out? Because when you're up against vested interest, it certainly can take a very long time with significant casualty. So the question is, how do you see it playing out? And sometimes I think we have to be more purposeful about who we employ. So we have to employ for diversity so that the site of change is where you find yourself. But there may be other theories by which this plays out. So that's what I'm grappling with, and I'd love your insight.
Thank you. I want to say I'm talking about spiritual practice, right? I'm talking about rooting ourselves in spiritual practices that call us to recognize the divinity in every single person, that every single person created in the image of God deserves to live with dignity in a just society where they are able to live and to love and to have a thriving future. I think that's the deepest spiritual call. Acknowledging and rooting ourselves in that spiritual practice does not mean that we don't need political change. It doesn't mean that we don't need better policy. That I remember years ago, Bishop Barber said, when in the era in 2020, in that time of racial reckoning, and Bishop Barber said, we need to remove the statues, but don't let that take the place of the statutes that need to change, right? We have to change the laws, and we also have to change the spiritual heart. My work is rooted in the spirit because I realize that there are certain things that cannot have a political solution until we engage that there's a spiritual crisis at the heart of it. And so this work has to happen together, and I think that's part of the beauty of this collective, actually, having all different kinds of change makers at the table, educators and policymakers, and people who engage spiritually, and people who are healers of body and spirit in the room. And I think that what we need to do, I'm going to give you I spoke about Shabbat a moment ago, and my Shabbat practice, my Sabbath practice of kind of disengaging the world purposefully for one day a week as a way of just keeping my sanity and keeping my love for humanity. But I also will say that Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg is a well-known, beloved rabbi of our time. Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg writes that we actually need to disconnect from the world in order to reimagine the kind of world that we know to be possible, in which every human being is created in and gets to live as though we are in God's own image. Because if we only engage in the work of political transformation, then we will forget the dream. We will be beaten down by the reality. There is so much working against us, entrenched political and economic interests that are working against us. But there's a deeper truth. And that deeper truth is that every single human being is precious, and that the death of any one person is a moral catastrophe. And we might forget that if we only live in the world as it is. And so this is a call, as much as we work to transform the world as it is, to also allow ourselves the space, the retreat, to once again reimagine the world as it could be.
Our final question over here.
Hi, my name is Mariana. I'm a Henry Crown Fellow. I'm also a journalist, and part of my field work is to go around the world to places like Haiti and the Syrian border and China and make people care about stories and people that are different from them. What I've seen, though, is this numbness that is prevailing of people just tuning out and not wanting to sit at the table, not wanting to engage in discourse, and being vulnerable right now, because that's the point of the Action Forum. I'm originally from Venezuela, and I'm not blameless. I've seen the 20-year destruction of my home country, and at times I've been like, I can't engage in this anymore, otherwise I won't be able to move forward in this, my new home. So going practically into a year of this conflict in Gaza, how do we, Gaza and so many other places around the world, how do we, starting this Action Forum, reignite that flame of just even wanting to engage in this conversation and wanting to do something? How do we awaken each other?
Thank you, Mariana, for your question and for your work. Are folks familiar with the work of Paul Slovic? He's a professor at University of Oregon. He did a series of studies called the Rokia studies some years ago, in which he went around campus and he asked students, he showed them a picture of this beautiful little girl about 5 years old, and he said, her name's Rokia and she's starving to death. Would you give $5 to help save her life? And almost every single person said yes and gave $5. And then he zoomed out the picture of Rokia, and there was a picture of Rokia with her brother Musa. And he went around campus and said, Rokia and Musa are starving to death. Would you give $5 to save them? And the numbers dropped by 50% of the people who were willing to do it, because the pain was already bigger than just one. And then he zoomed out the camera even more, and you could see that there were 100 children. And he went around campus and said, would you give $5 to save these children of this community who are dying? And almost nobody contributed, because it was just too great. And he is the one who coined the term psychic numbness, that this happens to us when we feel that there's just too much pain. We actually can't take the pain in anymore because we feel our systems shut down. We feel like I can't, there's no more room inside me. And just this morning, I was reading about children from Gaza who are being airlifted out of Gaza in order to get emergency medical treatment, and there was this picture of this little boy. He looks like my nephew, who's Israeli and lives in Tel Aviv, except this poor kid lives on the other side of the border, and he's sick, and he needs to get out of Gaza in order to get medical treatment. And I just stared at this kid, and he just broke my heart again. And it reaffirmed my commitment to bring this message that every single person is created in God's own image. It doesn't matter which side of that broken down fence you were born on. Because this child touched my heart. And I brought it to David and said, David, look at this little one. Look at this boy. We have to help him, right? And so I think part of the work of journalists and pastors and teachers is to help us remember Rokia, right? That even if there are 100 children in that picture, to help us zoom in on one so that our hearts can continue to be broken until all of those children are able to truly thrive. And by the way, if you think that sounds naive and foolish, like I actually do believe that we can build together a world in which every single human being, every single child can truly thrive. But in order to do that, we actually have to break open our own moral imagination. We have to be brave enough to say things that people will say are stupid and naive and impossible. And then we have to find the partners who are willing to work with us to make that impossible dream a reality.
Thank you so much. Before I give you last final words as we send you off to the airport and hope your flight goes okay. I wanted to thank you all for these incredible questions. We've extended the seminar time this week to be able to bring some of those questions and do some of that meaning making together, so we're not rushing into text. So I just want to let you know that was on purpose, and we've got you. Any final bits of wisdom for us as we head into this week?
Yeah, I'm going to say one word about joy, okay? Because I feel sometimes we misperceive joy to be a kind of luxury that we can't afford because there's so much pain in the world. And I actually see joy as not a luxury item, but as a spiritual necessity. And I just want to invite you, as you do the hard work of stretching open your own heart and each other's here also, to invite laughter and dance and song and joy also into the space and also into our lives. We need this so desperately. I speak about one of my dearest friends who was grieving the death of her beloved partner, and she realized she didn't want to be one of those widows who dresses in sackcloth and ashes and just weeps for a year, because what she loved about him was that he was full of joy. And so she set her phone alarm for 18 minutes a day during her year of mourning and forced herself to do something that would give her joy, like eat the whole chocolate cake, right? Or like dance alone in your apartment. Or just talk to people who make you laugh, or watch Key and Peele sketches, or do something that will actually fill you with laughter and fill you with hope. And she did that for a whole year. She manifested her grief through her joy. Even in the midst of grieving, we can and we must experience joy, and I bless you that you're able to find that with one another as we all engage in this holy work of trying to heal ourselves and our world. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon.